Every time you start a new Claude Code session, you shouldn't have to explain the same things all over again. A CLAUDE.md file lets you write those instructions down once, so Claude can read them whenever it works on your project. In this video, I'll build one from scratch and show you what belongs inside it, what you should leave out, and why I recommend building your first one yourself instead of using the /init command. What is a CLAUDE.md file? Claude Code starts each new session with a fresh context window. Unless the important background is written down somewhere it can read, you may find yourself giving the same explanation or correcting the same mistake again and again. A CLAUDE.md file solves that problem. It gives Claude a short set of instructions about what you're working on, how you want the work done, and what it should avoid. Claude reads that file when it starts working on your project. So it already has that context before you begin. This file is for Claude Code specifically. Claude Code is the version of Claude that works directly with the files and folders on your computer. It can open them, read them, and make changes instead of only chatting with you in a browser tab. You can use it from the command line, and it's also available inside Claude desktop app. So you don't have to be a programmer or live in a terminal to use it. And that's why it works differently from a normal chat. A regular chat can read these files you upload, but it won't automatically search your computer for a CLAUDE.md file. Claude Code will. When you open a project file, it looks for those instructions and loads them automatically. It's the same basic idea as projects or custom instructions. Give the AI important background information once, rather than repeating it in every conversation. Other AI coding tools use similar files. OpenAI's Codex, for example, uses agents.md for persistent project instructions. The file lives in your project folder. It's a plain text file and should be named CLAUDE.md. Make sure Claude is spelled in caps. MD stands for Markdown, a simple way to format things like headings and bullet points. One important thing to watch: some computers quietly add text to the end of the file name. Make sure the file name is CLAUDE.md and nothing else. There's no official template you have to follow. It can be neatly organized with headlines or simple lists of instructions. You don't need any special software. Any text or markdown editor will do. I'll create the file right now. Before we start typing, you need to know that CLAUDE.md files can live in more than one place. Where the file lives decides how widely its instructions apply. There are several possible locations, but two matter the most when you're starting out. The one we just created sits in a project folder, and it applies to this project. You can also keep a global CLAUDE.md file that applies across every project you open. That global file lives inside a hidden folder called .claude in your home folder. Claude Code loads both the files and uses them together. The global file contains preferences that should follow you from one project to another. The project file contains instructions that only apply to the work within this folder. If you're not sure where a rule belongs, ask yourself one question. Would this still be true if I opened up a completely different project tomorrow? If the answer is yes, it belongs in your global file. If the answer is no, it belongs in your project file. Explain technical terms in plain English, or always ask before installing anything. Belongs in your global file. Finished scripts go in your scripts folder, or check the brand guide before writing. Belongs in your project file. There's also a practical reason to keep them separate. The project file can travel within the project you're working on, so it should contain the instructions anyone working on that project needs. Your global file stays with you and follows you into the other project. And don't put the same rule in both files. Eventually, you'll update one copy and forget about the other, leaving Claude with two different versions of the same instructions. If the files contradict each other, don't assume Claude will resolve the conflict the way you expect. Keep the instructions consistent. For this video, we're building the project file because these instructions apply to this particular project. Start with a short description of the project, just a couple of sentences. This project teaches people how to use AI tools. Everything here is written to be read out loud in a video, so write it to the ear, not the page. That tells Claude what it's working on, who the work is for, and how the result should be written. 4 common things you should leave out. First, anything Claude can work out on its own by looking at the project. You don't need to describe every folder and file. Claude can already inspect that project. Second, standard information it already knows. You don't need to teach Claude the basic parts of its job. Third, anything that changes frequently. It will quickly go stale, and then you'll be giving Claude outdated instructions. And fourth, advice that sounds good but doesn't tell Claude what to do. For example, write clean code, be professional. Those instructions are too vague to be useful. If Claude already does it correctly without being told, delete the instruction. You're not writing a manual for everything. You're writing down the things Claude would not reliably get on its own. Next, add the practical details Claude needs. First, file locations. Where should finished scripts be saved? Where do the brand guidelines live? Which folder contains the source material? Claude may be able to see those folders, but it cannot always know which ones you want it to use. Second, add how the work actually gets done. Be specific. Do a good job is useless. Every claim about a tool needs a source saved in a research folder first. Is actionable. Third, add the boundaries. These may be the most important instructions in the entire file because they spell out the mistakes that could cost you time or money. For example, never edit file X. Don't send emails to clients without my approval. Boundaries can save you from hours of frustration, but there's an important caveat. A line in CLAUDE.md file is guidance, not a physical safeguard. It tells Claude what you want, but it cannot guarantee that Claude will never do something else. If Claude Code genuinely must never read or change something, don't rely only on a sentence in this file. Use Claude Code's permissions and deny those rules to enforce that boundary. For a rule you really cannot afford to have missed, you can also make it easy to spot by writing important or you must in front of it, but use that sparingly. If everything is marked important, nothing stands out. And when a rule isn't obvious, add a short explanation of why it exists. For example, never assume prior knowledge because our audience will leave if they feel lost. Finally, keep the files short. Anthropic recommends targeting fewer than 200 lines. Longer files use more context and can make individual instructions easier to miss. One important note, CLAUDE.md is a strong guidance, not a guarantee. Claude may still miss an instruction occasionally. That's why the file should be clear, concise, specific, and free of contradictions. The better it is written, the more consistently Claude can follow it. You don't have to get this perfectly on day one. A useful CLAUDE.md file grows naturally as you work. But how do you know when something is worth adding? There are two simple signals. The first is that Claude makes the same mistake twice. The second is that you catch yourself typing a correction you already gave Claude in an earlier session. Either one is a sign your CLAUDE.md file may be missing an instruction. Claude can write new instructions into the file for you. Claude Code also has a feature called auto memory. As you work, Claude can save notes about useful patterns, corrections, and preferences it discovers. It won't save everything, but over time it can build a useful notebook from the way you work. You can view or edit those notes by typing /memory. Your CLAUDE.md file is the manual you write on purpose. Auto memory is the notebook Claude keeps for itself. Claude Code also has a command called /init. When you type it, Claude scans the project and creates a starting Claude.md file based on what it finds. If a Claude.md file already exists, it can suggest improvements rather than simply replacing it. That can be useful, but I don't recommend accepting the results without reviewing every line, especially when you're creating your first file. /init is good at discovering things that already exist inside the project, such as commands, technical setup, and project conventions. What it cannot automatically know are what instructions that often matter most to you. So whether you start with a blank file or use /init, treat the result as a starting point rather than a finished instruction file. Read every line and ask the same question. Will this change how Claude works? If it won't, remove it. For the first file, I'll recommend starting small and writing the important instructions yourself. That will force you to understand why each line is there. Once you have the file you like, you don't need to build the next one completely from scratch. You can copy the structure into the new project and replace the project-specific details. Just don't paste the whole file blindly, or you'll carry out old file names and outdated rules into the project where they don't belong. If Claude starts ignoring the file, there are 4 common things to check. First, did the file actually load? Type /context and look for the CLAUDE.md file under the memory files. That tells you what actually loaded into the session. If you want to open or edit the files themselves, use /memory. Second, is there another CLAUDE.md file contradicting it? Your global file may say one thing while the project file says something else. Third, is the instruction too vague? If Claude keeps asking questions about something the file is supposed to answer, make the expected behavior more specific. Fourth, has the file become too long? If Claude repeatedly misses a rule you know is written down, that instruction may be buried among too many other notes. cut the file back to the instructions that genuinely matter. And that's the file we built. It doesn't try to predict every possible situation. It contains only the instructions that would genuinely change how Claude works on this project. The biggest mistake people make is trying to prepare for everything that might happen later. They cram pages of notes into the file just in case, and before long it becomes an unreadable wall of text. A focused 40-line file containing only the instructions that matter will usually be easier for Claude to follow than a rambling 200-line file filled with unnecessary details. Start small and use the file for a while. When Claude Code repeats a mistake or you find yourself giving the same correction again, decide whether that instruction belongs in that file. That is how useful CLAUDE.md grows. And remove anything that no longer affects how Claude works. Do that and your CLAUDE.md file will stay short, useful, and easy for Claude to follow. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.